March 1979. Carl Jensen walked into the biggest John Deere dealership in Story County with $3,200 cash in his jacket pocket. He was 52, a Korean War vet who'd been farming since 1953. He wanted one thing, a used tractor he could buy outright and never worry about again. What happened next would haunt him for decades and prove him right in ways nobody saw coming. Three salesmen stood around a brand new John Deere 4440, bragging about their February commissions. Rick Morrison, the senior guy, had pulled in $1,400 in a single month. Dave Patterson drove a car worth more than most farmers' annual income. Brad Stevens, fresh out of Iowa State, was living the dream at 24. Business was exploding. Corn was over $3 a bushel. Land values climbing 10% yearly, and farmers were financing everything like money grew on trees. Carl approached Rick with his cap in his hands, boots still muddy, looking for a used tractor something around $3,000. Rick sized him up in 2 seconds. Worn Carhartt, faded jeans, old boots, small time. Not worth the effort. Used equipment? Rick's enthusiasm died instantly. We don't really deal in that anymore. Market's too hot for new. Everyone's financing because they can afford the payments. He paused. Maybe we've got a 72 out back, probably $6,000 to $12,000. Need something cheaper, Carl said quietly. Got $3,200 cash. That's when Dave Patterson started laughing. $3,200 for a tractor. What are you going to buy? A lawnmower. Brad Stevens barked out a laugh that echoed across the showroom. Other customers turned to see what was funny. Carl stood there, alone, while three men in pressed shirts and loosened ties looked at him like he'd just crawled out of a time machine. You can't compete in 1979 with $3,000 equipment, Rick said, his tone shifting to pure dismissal. The guys making it out there are running new. 4440s, 4640s, big iron, modern equipment, financed. That's how you stay competitive. I'm not looking to compete, Carl said. Just looking to farm my land. Got 280 acres. Need a tractor that works. Dave moved closer, smelling blood. You won't be farming long with antique equipment. This is 1979, not 1959. Wake up. Farming has changed. Carl didn't argue. He didn't explain his philosophy about debt being dangerous and cash being safety. He just asked one more time, you got anything in my price range or not? Try the salvage dealer in Ames, Brad said, still grinning. Might find something that still runs. Barely. Dave laughed again. Yeah, Pete Hendricks has all the junk nobody else wants. Perfect for your budget. Carl turned and walked out. As he pushed through the glass doors into the cold morning, he heard Dave's voice carry. Some people just don't get it. Trying to farm in 1979 with $3,000 might as well use a team of horses. More laughter followed Carl to his truck. But here's what those salesmen didn't know. 30 minutes south in Ames, Pete Hendricks ran a small used equipment lot. At 73, he'd seen boom times and bust times since 1952. When Carl walked in asking for something reliable around $3,000, Pete didn't laugh. He didn't smirk. He showed Carl a 1964 Farmall 806, 15 years old, paint faded, seat cracked, but mechanically sound. The previous owner had maintained it meticulously. Engine had 4,800 hours. Hydraulics perfect. PTO good. $3,000 even cash. Carl test drove it. Everything felt solid, tight, well maintained. He pulled the envelope from his jacket and counted out $300 bills right there. You made a good buy, Pete said while writing up the sale. Don't let anyone tell you different. A paid-for tractor that runs is worth more than a new one you're making payments on. I've seen a lot of farmers go under because they confused looking successful with being successful. Pete paused. You go to the John Deere place first? Yeah, they laughed at me. Pete nodded slowly. They laugh at everyone who wants to pay cash. But I've been doing this since '52. I've seen 3 big busts. Farmers who buy used and pay cash survive. Farmers who buy new and finance heavy. A lot of them don't. Carl drove that 806 home at 25 mph. passing Midland Implement on the way. He wondered if those salesmen saw him. Let them laugh, he thought. Time would tell who was right. But nobody, not Carl, not the salesman, not anyone, saw what was coming. Through 1979 and 1980, life was good for everyone except Carl's pride. His neighbors had shiny new 4440s and 46 Caprices. They looked successful. They looked like winners. Carl looked like the past. Rick Morrison was making $80,000 to $90,000 in commissions alone. Doctor money. He bought a 3,000 square foot house in Ames with a swimming pool. Bought his wife a new Buick. Dave Patterson bought a bright red Cadillac Eldorado for $18,000. More than most farmers cleared in profit that year. Brad Stevens got engaged, bought a house for $72,000, got married in a big ceremony. The dealership gave him a $2,000 wedding bonus. He was making $45,000 a year at 25. They were riding high. Then 1981 arrived. Interest rates spiked to 21.5% in June. The Federal Reserve, killing inflation, raised rates to levels not seen since the Civil War. Farmers who'd borrowed at variable rates saw their payments double or triple overnight. Corn prices collapsed from 320 to 280s, then 240. By fall, 210. Land values that had climbed relentlessly suddenly stopped, then fell precipitously. Land worth $2,000 an acre in 1980 dropped to $1,600 in 1981, then $1,200 in 82. Farmers who'd bought at the peak were underwater. Their debt hadn't changed, but their income had been cut in half. The dealerships felt it instantly. Orders dried up. Farmers who'd put deposits down on tractors called to cancel or just disappeared. By the end of 1981, Midland Implement's sales had fallen 70%. They'd sold 42 tractors in 1980. In 1981, 13. Rick Morrison's income dropped from $85,000 to $28,000. Dave Patterson, $73,000 to $19,000. Brad Stevens, $21,000, barely covering his mortgage. In 1982, it got worse. 3 mechanics laid off. Parts department slashed. Salesman commissions cut from 15% to 10%. Rick put his house up for sale. The market had collapsed. He took a $40,000 loss just to escape the mortgage. Moved his family into a rented house in tiny Nevada, Iowa. His youngest daughter cried every night for a month. Dave sold the Cadillac in August 1982 for $7,200, less than half what he'd paid. Bought a used Chevy pickup for $3,800. Tried to hold on to his house. Couldn't. Bank foreclosed in December. Dave, his wife, and 3 kids moved in with his parents in Des Moines. He was 36 years old, living in his childhood bedroom while his kids slept on couches. Brad Stevens took a second job at night stocking shelves at Kmart. His wife became a secretary. They ate ramen and government cheese, but their mortgage was $720 a month. More than Brad made some months. They missed one payment, then another, then a third. Bank started foreclosure in May 1983. On July 15, 1983, Midland Implement didn't open. A sign on the door, closed until further notice. Everyone knew what that meant. The dealership was finished. The building sat empty. The lot where shiny tractors had parked was just weeds and cracked concrete. Windows got soap painted with for lease signs that yellowed in the sun. Rick Morrison moved to Des Moines, selling insurance at Prudential. Hated it. Commissions were terrible compared to the tractor days, but it was steady. Dave Patterson ended up at the Firestone tire plant working the assembly line. $8.50 an hour, about $17,000 a year. 4 years earlier, he'd made $73,000 and driven a Cadillac. Now he wore steel-toed boots and came home smelling like rubber and chemicals. Brad Stevens became an assistant manager at Walmart, $14,000 a year. Lost his house, moved into a trailer park in Ankeny. The wedding photos from 1980 sat in a box in the trailer's tiny closet. He couldn't look at them. Meanwhile, Carl Jensen kept farming. The 1964 Farmall 806 kept running. When it needed repairs, and it needed several, Carl did them himself. Bought parts from salvage yards, from Pete Hendricks from farmers selling out, paid cash for everything. 1982, new water pump, radiator hoses, front axle bearings. Total parts cost, $287. His neighbor with the new Ford 440 was paying $1,947 monthly in tractor payments alone. 1984, clutch work, hydraulic pump rebuilt. Total cost, $612, still cheaper than 2 months of payments on a new tractor. Carl's total equipment expenses from 1981 to 1985 averaged $1,100 yearly. His neighbors with new equipment were paying $24,000 to $36,000 annually in equipment payments. When corn hit $2, $10, Carl hurt like everyone else. But he didn't have debt eating him alive. His land was paid for. His equipment was paid for. He could survive on $2, 10 corn. It wasn't comfortable, but he could survive. His neighbors couldn't. By 1985, 40% of the farmers in Story County had been foreclosed on or sold out voluntarily. It was the worst agricultural crisis since the Depression. Carl heard about the dealership closing from a neighbor. He felt bad for the employees, but couldn't muster much sympathy for the salesman who'd laughed at him 6 years earlier. The 806 ran until 1991, 12 years of service. Finally, the engine was burning oil, transmission getting sloppy. Carl decided retirement for the old tractor was earned. He bought a used John Deere 4230 at an estate sale for $12,000 cash. From 1976, 15 years old, meticulously maintained. Test drove it, liked it, wrote a check on the spot. His neighbors who'd survived were still struggling with debt from equipment bought in the late 70s. Some were driving tractors worth less than they owed. Upside down, on debt, they'd never escape. Carl had spent $1,200 total on tractors over 12 years. His neighbors who'd bought new Ford 440s in 1979 had paid $67,000 financed at 8 to 12% interest. By 1991, they'd paid maybe $95,000 total. The tractors were worth $22,000 if they were lucky. Then came 1995. Carl was at the Farm Bureau office, paying property taxes when he ran into Brad Stevens. Carl almost didn't recognize him. Brad was 41 but looked 55. Overweight, balding, defeated. Working as an insurance adjuster now. Carl Jensen, Brad said. Carl heard something in his voice. Embarrassment, maybe shame. They made awkward small talk. Then Brad said, "I've thought about you a lot over the years. About that day in '79 when you came into the dealership." Carl waited. "We laughed at you," Brad continued. "Dave and I, we laughed right to your face. Rick was more polite, but thinking the same thing. We thought you were a fool trying to buy used equipment for cash when everyone else was buying new on credit." Brad's voice got quieter. "Turns out we were the fools. We didn't understand anything. We thought the boom would last forever. Every tractor we sold, every combine. We were loading farmers with debt they couldn't handle when prices fell. And when the crisis hit, we lost everything too. Lost my house, lost my marriage. We divorced in '87, lost my career. I'm 41 years old making $32,000 a year adjusting insurance claims." Brad looked at Carl directly. "You were right and we were wrong. That's what I wanted to say. I've owed you that for 16 years. I appreciate that, Brad. Are you still farming?" "Still farming. Same 280 acres, same strategy. Buy used, pay cash, make it last." Brad shook his head. "The dealership that laughed at you is gone. The salesmen are all doing something else. But you're still farming. There's a lesson in that." Carl retired in 2003 at 76. He'd farmed for 50 years. Sold his 280 acres to a neighbor for $2,800 per acre. Total sale, $784,000. He'd started with nothing, farmed his entire life with used equipment, never had an equipment payment, never had a land payment, never owed a bank anything. Retiring with nearly $800,000 in cash, plus Social Security, plus decades of savings. The salesman who'd laughed at him in 1979 had made big money for a few years, then lost it all. Carl had made modest money for 50 years and kept all of it because he had no debt to service. Carl lived comfortably in retirement, bought a small house in Story City, traveled with his wife to places they'd never had time to visit. He died peacefully in his sleep in May 2018 at 92. His daughter Linda was cleaning out his desk a few weeks after the funeral when she found a yellowed newspaper clipping. Des Moines Register, July 17, 1983. Farm crisis. Claims another victim. Midland Implement. Closes after 31 years. The article detailed the closure, mentioned the three salesmen by name, talked about the farm equipment industry collapsing. Someone, presumably her father, had circled the article with a blue pen and written in the margin in his distinctive handwriting. The Laffers went bankrupt. The farmer with the old Farmall is still here. CJ, July 1983. Linda showed it to her brother Tom at the funeral luncheon. Dad never forgot that day, Tom said. He told me about it probably 20 times over the years. How those salesmen laughed at him for wanting to buy used equipment for cash. Did it bother him? Tom thought about that. At the time, yeah, but later I think he was proud of it. Proud that he'd been right when everyone else was wrong. Proud that he'd survived when they hadn't. That clipping proves it. He kept it for 35 years. At Carl's funeral, his son-in-law Mike gave part of the eulogy. Carl wasn't flashy, Mike said to the packed church. He never had the biggest farm or the newest equipment. To outsiders, he probably looked like he was struggling. Mike paused. But Carl wasn't struggling. He was thriving because he understood something most people didn't. Looking successful and being successful are two very different things. Looking successful meant new equipment, a big operation. Being successful meant owning what you had, having no debt, weathering bad times. Mike told the story of Carl going to Midland Implement in 1979, the salesman laughing, the dealership going bankrupt 4 years later. Carl never forgot the day those salesmen laughed at him. He kept that newspaper clipping for 35 years. Not out of spite, I don't think, but as a reminder. The people who laugh at you for being conservative are usually the ones taking the biggest risks. And when those risks fail, the laughers disappear. But the careful ones, the boring ones, the ones mocked for being too cautious, they're still there. He looked out at the crowd. Carl farmed for 50 years, bought used equipment, paid cash for everything, never owed anyone. The John Deere salesmen who laughed at him in 1979 were bankrupt by 1983. Carl farmed for 20 more years after that, retired wealthy, died in his own home at 92, surrounded by family. Mike let that hang in the air. Who was the fool, the laughers or the man they laughed at? After the funeral, some of Carl's old neighbors gathered at the farm. Vernon, who'd survived the crisis through similar conservatism, said, "I remember 1979. Everyone was buying new equipment. If you weren't modernizing, you were considered behind the times. Carl and I were the old fools who didn't get it." He smiled. "Turns out we were the only ones who did get it. We got that debt kills. We got that new equipment doesn't make you money. It costs you money." A younger neighbor, maybe 50, spoke up. "It's happening again. Different scale, bigger numbers, same pattern. Farmers buying $400,000 combines, $300,000 tractors, all financed. Everyone says you have to or you can't compete. Same thing they said in 1979. Vernon nodded. "And they're probably wrong again." The crisis will come. Could be 5 years, could be 10. Prices will fall or costs will spike, and all those farmers with big debt loads will be in trouble. The ones with paid-for equipment, the ones people call old-fashioned or cheap, they'll survive. He looked at Carl's old machine shed. Carl understood that. That's why he kept that newspaper clipping. To remind himself that being mocked for being conservative is better than being praised for being reckless. The praise disappears when the crisis hits, but the conservatism keeps you farming. The John Deere salesman laughed when Carl Jensen paid cash for that old Farmall in 1979. 4 years later, all three were unemployed, their dealership bankrupt, their finances in ruins. They'd made big money during the boom, but lost it all in the bust. Carl farmed for 47 more years after that day, farmed with used equipment, paid cash for everything, avoided debt like poison. Retired in 2003 with $784,000 from his land sale, plus substantial savings. Lived comfortably until he died at 92. The laughers lost. The careful farmer won. No complicated theories, no secret strategies, just simple math. Debt multiplies your risk. Cash eliminates it. When people laugh at you for being too conservative, too careful, too scared of debt, you're probably doing something right, because the ones laughing are usually the ones who will be gone when the crisis hits. Carl Jensen understood that in 1979, kept understanding it for the next 48 years, died understanding it, and left behind a newspaper clipping with a simple message written in blue pen. The laughers went bankrupt. The farmer with the old Farmall is still here. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. The next one might change how you think about money forever.